In many respects, Fairfield, Iowa is a quintessential Midwestern American town. With just 9,500 residents, it couldn't be more different than the big cities of Des Moines, Iowa, or St. Louis, Missouri, both of which were just a few hours away. Drug offenses, assaults, and burglaries aren't unheard of, but Fairfield is a relatively safe and close-knit community. However, the residents were confronted with an unspeakably brutal and shocking crime in the fall of 2021.
Unspeakable. That's the word one school official is using to describe the murder of a beloved high school teacher. Her body, with severe trauma to the head, was found hidden in a local park. And now 2 16-year-old students have been charged as adults in her killing.
The victim was a beloved high school teacher who taught at Fairfield High School for nearly a decade. Surprisingly, early evidence suggested that 2 of her students had committed the crime, and they were motivated by a petty academic dispute. Before we begin, we would like to express our deepest sympathies to the family, friends, co-workers, and students of Nohema Graber. Nohema Castillo was born in Veracruz, Mexico on November 10, 1954. After high school, she spent nearly 2 decades working as a flight attendant. Later, she became one of the first female airline pilots in Mexico. Nohema married Paul Graber in the fall of 1986. They moved to Fairfield, Iowa in 1992 to raise their growing family. In addition to being a doting wife and mother, Nohema was a devout Catholic and a tireless advocate for the community's burgeoning Latino population. She and Paul eventually divorced, but they remained lifelong friends. As her children grew into adults, she needed a new challenge to occupy her time and mind. Since she had always wanted to be an educator, she went back to school and got her teaching certificate from Iowa Wesleyan University. She initially taught Spanish at another high school before transferring to Fairfield High in 2012. Miss Graber's positive attitude and dynamic teaching style endeared her to the administrators, co-workers, and students alike.
Happy Teacher Appreciation Week, Mrs. Graber. Thank you for all that you do in and out of the classroom. We really appreciate how much fun we have in your class and how much Spanish we learn. And we just hope you have a really good day. Gracias.
That being said, one of her students didn't like that she held everyone to high standards, and on at least one occasion he voiced his opinion in no uncertain terms. 16-year-old Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale both studied Spanish with Miss Graber at Fairfield High School. We don't know much about their childhoods, family lives, or school records up to this point, but in the fall of 2021, Miss Graber gave Willard an F. It's unclear if he just didn't have a knack for Spanish or whether he wasn't putting forth enough effort to get a better grade. Either way, the F significantly lowered his grade point average, and he was not happy about it. Miss Graber agreed to meet Willard to discuss the situation on the afternoon of Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. It's just speculation, but she may have only agreed to the meeting out of courtesy. As a public school teacher, she had to do everything by the book in case Willard or his parents took the matter to school administrators. Miss Graber was well liked, but again, she had a reputation for holding students to exceptionally high standards. As such, she may not have had any intention of changing the grade. Whatever the case, the meeting was less cordial and more heated than she thought it would be. In fact, a few other students heard Willard and Miss Graber arguing as they walked past her classroom. Willard apparently told her that she wasn't an effective teacher and that he did not deserve an F. Then he stormed out. Miss Graber spent the next few hours at school, but she left at about 3:30 p.m. and drove to the nearby Chautauqua Park. Afternoon walks in the park were her way of unwinding and recharging her batteries after long days in a classroom. On that day, a long walk in Mother Nature must have seemed even more appealing than usual considering the confrontation she had had with Willard Miller just a few hours earlier. Miss Graber parked her van in the lot around 4 p.m., and she set off down the trail like she always did. By then, the sun was setting and the temperature was noticeably cooler than it had been during the high part of the day. Miss Graber's walks usually lasted about an hour, but about 45 minutes later, witnesses saw 2 young males driving her van out of the lot and away from the park. Shortly thereafter, a mutual friend picked them up on the side of the road after they ditched the van in a remote area nearby. Later, another witness saw a suspicious-looking young man pushing a wheelbarrow down the street towards the Chautauqua Park just before midnight. Miss Graber was too responsible, considerate, and level-headed to go off without letting her friends and family members know where she would be. They became mildly concerned that evening because no one had seen or heard from her since she left school. In the early going, they assumed she was just having dinner with a friend or attending a school meeting or a community event that no one knew about. There was certainly no indication that she had been injured or in danger, or that she had been a victim of a crime. Nonetheless, they became more alarmed when she had not shown up by the following morning, and one of her friends eventually called the police to report her missing. Officers began by searching the areas she was known to frequent, like the school grounds and Chautauqua Park, where she walked most afternoons. They didn't find any sign of her or her vehicle around the school, her home, or the homes of any friends or family members. When they got to the park, the portion of the trail near the lot was just as pristine and picturesque as always. But shortly into the search, they noticed an odd pile of rubbish just a few yards off the trail. Initially, they thought maybe a homeowner or a contractor may have dumped the waste in the park illegally. But as they approached to take a closer look, it became apparent they were dealing with something far more sinister. Just moments into the search, they discovered Miss Graber's battered and lifeless body partially concealed under a tarp, railroad ties, and a beat-up wheelbarrow.
66-year-old Nohema Graber taught at Fairfield High School in Iowa. Her body was found hidden under a tarp, wheelbarrow, and railroad ties.
Officers immediately knew they had found missing high school teacher Mrs. Graber, but they had no idea who had committed the grisly crime or why. Officers and investigators were shocked at the brutality of the crime and that the victim was a 66-year-old pillar of the community. Early on, they had no idea what could have motivated the perpetrator or perpetrators to commit the murder. They weren't even sure if it was robbery, sexual assault, or possibly racially motivated because of Miss Graber being Hispanic. Either way, they were all just unsubstantiated theories. But one thing was clear: whoever committed the crime must have harbored some animosity toward the victim. The residents of Fairfield were aghast and heartbroken when they found out about the murder. In light of the tragedy, Fairfield High School students were dismissed early on Thursday, and classes were canceled until the following Monday. However, pastors and counselors were available for anyone who needed help dealing with their emotions and coming to grips with the fact that Nohema Graber had been murdered and the guilty party or parties were still at large. Thankfully, investigators got a huge break when an acquaintance of Jeremy Goodale's came forward with a remarkable tip. He showed investigators a number of eye-opening social media exchanges he had had with Jeremy. Some even included details of Miss Graber's disappearance and death that had not been released to the public. On one occasion, Mr. Goodale had even boasted about killing Miss Graber on Snapchat. Investigators kept the messages confidential, but an agent with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation named Trent Vailta said they were extremely graphic and detailed how the murder was planned and carried out. Of course, this didn't prove that Jeremy Goodale actually killed Miss Graber. People often boast about committing crimes they had nothing to do with because it gives them a sense of power and importance. On the other hand, it was possible and even likely that Jeremy Goodale killed Miss Graber, or at the very least was present when the murder took place. The acquaintance also described the clothes Jeremy was wearing on the day she was killed. This new information gave investigators enough probable cause to obtain a search warrant for Jeremy's residence, and during multiple searches, found clothes just like the ones the tipster said he was wearing on November the 2nd. Even more damningly, there appeared to be bloodstains on some of them. Investigators also confiscated 2 baseball bats, bath towels, and a number of strands of hair that were sent to the crime lab for analysis. After Jeremy's home was searched, both teenagers were questioned separately. Unsurprisingly, they both claimed that they had only acted as lookouts and that the other actually delivered the blows that killed Miss Graber. Later, Willard Miller allegedly admitted that he provided the material that was used in the murder. He also fessed up to being in the park when Miss Graber was killed, to removing evidence from the crime scene, and to taking a wheelbarrow from his home to the park later that night. However, he denied participating in the murder itself. Instead, he said it was completely committed by a group of rambunctious teenagers wearing masks, and that they forced him to help hide Miss Graber's body after she was already dead. Investigators didn't believe either of the boys' versions of the events, and by then they had a substantial amount of evidence against them, including items that had been taken from Jeremy Goodale's home. Very little of the evidence was ever released to the public. They knew it would come out during or immediately after the trial, but in the meantime, investigators began putting together an amazingly accurate timeline of events leading up to the brutal murder. Police arrested Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale on Friday, November the 5th, 2021, 2 days after Miss Graber's body had been found. Shortly afterward, Jeremy Goodale allegedly told investigators that he and Willard Miller surveilled, stalked, and then murdered Mrs. Graber on Wednesday, November the 2nd, 2021. They were each charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit a forcible felony and held on $1 million bond at a local juvenile detention center. That same evening, hundreds of mourners gathered outside the Fairfield High School auditorium for a poignant candlelight vigil. Attendees held hands, sang songs, and even shared stories of how 66-year-old Nohema Graber had touched their lives. Even so, the community was still so shaken by the murder that officers in riot gear were called to patrol the perimeter of the somber event. Because both were 16 years old when the crime was committed, the attorneys for Willard and Jeremy petitioned to have their clients tried in juvenile court. This was a big deal because a conviction in juvenile court would mean they would both be released on their 18th birthday. In other words, they would serve less than 2 years for the brutal murder of Miss Graber. But if they were convicted of the same crime in adult court, they might well spend the rest of their lives in prison. The prosecution argued that the defendants couldn't possibly be rehabilitated in such a short period of time, and that they would pose an imminent threat to the community if and when they were released. The judge ultimately agreed and ordered Jeremy Goodale and Willard Miller to be tried as adults.
And keeping in mind that the court will not permit anyone to plead guilty who claims to be innocent, what is your plea to murder in the first degree? Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Mr. Goodale, in order for the court, for me to accept your guilty plea, I must be convinced there's a factual basis. And I'm going to have your attorneys assist you with this next part of the guilty plea. And they're going to ask you about what you did on or about November 2nd of 2021 that leads you to plead guilty to murder in the first degree.
In another bit of pretrial wrangling, defense attorneys moved to have the proceedings closed to the public. They didn't want their clients to be demonized by the media or convicted in the court of public opinion before they had their day in Jefferson County Court. Willard Miller's attorney, Christine Branstad, also attempted to have much of the evidence collected against her client thrown out on the grounds that investigators failed to show the issuing magistrate that the tipster was reliable. If successful, Willard Miller's Snapchat posts and social media conversations, the physical evidence collected from his home, the data on his phone, and the conversations he had had with investigators would all be inadmissible. However, the judge ultimately ruled that the warrants were obtained legally and the aforementioned evidence was therefore admissible. Jeremy Goodale and Willard Miller both pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in mid-April of 2023. However, there still would be a trial and they would be tried separately, with the results impacting on their sentencing. From the very beginning, investigators and prosecutors believed that the motive was a petty dispute over a failing grade Willard Miller had received from Miss Graber.
Having known Shaden, having him in my math class, he did speak not in a murderous way, but in a very aggressive way for a dislike towards Miss Graber.
A couple of students at the school told us they heard an argument Tuesday afternoon about trying to get a grade up in Graber's class.
While Miss Graber's heartbroken friends and family looked on, prosecutors laid out how angry Willard Miller was about the F that she had given him on his report card. They also heard about the heated argument that they had the day she was killed. In addition, they learned that he had recruited Jeremy Goodale 2 weeks before the crime was committed, that they followed Miss Graber to study her daily routine, and that they had attacked her at Chautauqua Park because it was secluded and rarely had visitors during that time of the day.
Mr. Goodale in those minutes details out how Mr. Miller approached him and essentially recruited him to be involved in this, and that it was over a grade that that Mr. Miller had in Ms. Graber's class, and that provided the impetus and the motive behind this crime that Mr. Goodale then joined into with Mr. Miller and committed.
This went a long way toward establishing premeditation as well as the boys' cold, calculating, and altogether heartless natures.
Police say the 2 accused boys knew that she took a stroll in the park every day and that they were waiting to ambush her. The cause of death is said to be a blow to her head.
On the stand, Jeremy Goodale confirmed that they carefully stalked and planned the murder for over 2 weeks. He also admitted to striking the victim multiple times in the head and neck with a baseball bat. Afterward, he said that he and Willard Miller dragged her off the trail and struck her until she was dead, covering her body with railroad ties, and removed as much evidence as they could from the crime scene.
I'll begin with, what was it that you did on November the 2nd, 2021 that caused you to be here today?
On November 2nd of 2021, I met Willard Miller at Chautauqua Park. I understood that he had the intent to kill Mrs. Graber. Shaden had brought a bat, among other supplies, to go through with the murder. And after he had struck Nohema Graber, we then moved her off of the trail, where I then struck her, and she died as a result. Afterwards, we removed any evidence that we could, and that was my recollection of the events on November 2nd.
Since they had only hastily covered the body that day, they returned later that night to do a more thorough job. Now, the outcome of the trial was never really in question because both defendants had pleaded guilty after they were arrested. As shocking and distressing as the trials were for Miss Graber's loved ones, at that point, the real question was whether the judge would show leniency when it came time to hand down their sentences. According to Iowa state law, all juvenile offenders must be given the opportunity for parole regardless of the severity of their crime. Due to Willard Miller's central role in the murder, prosecutors sought a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. For Jeremy Goodale, they sought 25 years to life. Willard Miller was the first to learn his fate in early July of 2023. At the sentencing hearing, Assistant Iowa Attorney General Scott Brown described the murder as cruel and heinous and said that he couldn't imagine a more horrible way to die. He also reminded everyone that this was all over a failing grade. Before taking his seat, he said that Willard Miller deserved every single day that he would spend in prison. Afterward, Willard apologized for the distress and devastation he caused the Graber family.
I'd like to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly accept responsibility for the role that I've played in the murder of Nohema Graber. I would like to apologize for my actions, first and foremost, to the family. I'm sincerely sorry for the distress that I've caused you and the devastation I've caused your family, and from the bottom of my heart, I am sorry for your loss.
In a particularly poignant moment, Miss Graber's brother-in-law, Jim, addressed Willard Miller, saying that he hoped he asked the Lord for forgiveness because he was on a spiral straight to hell. A few weeks later, Judge Sean Showers sentenced Willard Miller to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years.
A teenager was sentenced to life in prison for murdering his high school Spanish teacher with the possibility of parole after 35 years. The judge had this to say.
Certainly a high school junior who formulates a plan, or high schooler who formulates a plan with a friend, and murders a Spanish teacher is a dangerous person to the community.
Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale pleaded guilty to the crime from 2021. They were 16 at the time. The motive, prosecutors allege, a bad grade.
Judge Showers said there was no excuse for his evil and sinister actions, and that under the circumstances, he was lucky to get such a light sentence. Had he not been bound by Iowa law, the judge said he would have seriously considered, revoking the parole eligibility altogether. 5 months later, in mid-November, Jeremy Goodale was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. During the hearing, the prosecution reminded everyone that the last thing Miss Graber saw may have been Jeremy Goodale's face just before he struck her in the head with the baseball bat. In addition to their lengthy prison sentences, both defendants were ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution to Miss Graber's family, though it is unclear how they will ever be able to fulfill that obligation behind bars. Like Willard Miller, Jeremy Goodale apologized to Miss Graber's family, his own family, and the community as a whole. However, his emotions seemed far more sincere and heartfelt to Judge Showers and Miss Graber's friends and family members. Even so, the judge pointed out that he was an intelligent young man and that he had countless opportunities to prevent the crime from being committed in the weeks leading up to the murder. As is often the case, the victim's family were given an opportunity to address both defendants at the end of their trials.
I've got no hate in my heart for you, and I've met your mother on several occasions and we had good conversations.
Ironically, Miss Graber's son took the opportunity to tell Willard Miller that he bore him no ill will. After visiting from Mexico to attend the memorial service, her sister, Ciocoro Castillo, said that she was blown away by the impact she had had on the community. Fairfield Public School Superintendent Laurie Knoll may have summed it up best when she said that Miss Graber had touched so many lives in many ways that few others ever do. But by many accounts, neither the residents of Fairfield nor Nohema Graber's friends, relatives, students, or co-workers have fully come to grips with her death or the fact that she was brutally murdered by 2 of her 16-year-old students. After the trial, Fairfield officer Julie Kinsella said that the students and teachers were still terrified to go back to school over concerns for their safety. But sadly, she also said that she wasn't sure if the town would ever be the same again. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like the video, comment down below your take on it, and please subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the notification bell in order to stay up to date each time we reveal a new shocking case. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes peeled. You never know what's lurking in the shadows.